In the last lecture, we added this order now button down there, and it's working nice. Now I want to make sure that once we click the button, we open this modal with the order summary. Now for that, we obviously need a modal, we need a backdrop, and we need to show some order summary. The idea behind the modal is to have a wrapping element which provides the styling, which then simply wraps itself about any content we want to show in that modal. That makes sense to me at least. So I will create such a modal component, and I want to create it in a new folder. In the components folder, I'll create a UI subfolder for some general UI elements like the modal. So there I will add modal, and in there the modal.js file. As I said, we'll also need a backdrop, so I will add a backdrop folder in the UI folder too. I didn't add the backdrop to the modal because we might reuse the backdrop in other places too. For example, for the site drawer for the navigation we're about to add later. And in the backdrop folder, I therefore also add a backdrop.js file. Now we have these two components, and let's start with the modal now. How should this modal component look like? It's going to be a functional component. It doesn't have any state attached to it. It just receives some props and returns some JSX. And it might surprise you, but of course we import React from React here too. And we export the modal function as the default of this file. Now, how does the JSX code look like then? The modal should simply be a div in the end, which wraps itself around any content. So a div which is wrapped around props children. And props children really can be anything. Can be our own components, can be some text, a paragraph. That is totally up to us how we use the modal then. We can pass anything in there. Of course, the wrapping div should receive some styling to look good in the end, to have a modal look. So for that, I'm going to add a modal CSS file here. And there I also share some CSS code which you can find attached to this video, which you may just paste in there. There we have our modal class, and we can now see that this simply creates a fixed position modal, centers it in the middle of the page, and gives us a little box shadow, and also changes some of the stylings for broader screens. That really is all. With that, we can import the classes from that CSS file. So import classes from the modal CSS file and assign it to the wrapping div with the class name attribute. So here we have classes.modal with a capital M because that's the name of the CSS class. By the way, make sure to save that CSS file after you pasted my content in there. So that's the modal.js file. This will create such a modal. Now, let's add this modal right away. And the question, of course, is where in our application shall we add the modal? Well, I would say we add it in the place where we want to show it, because that is the logical place where it belongs and where we probably have the state and the methods to control the display. So in our case, that's the burger builder. Let's simply add an import at the top, modal from, and now we need to navigate to that modal file, which we can find in components, UI, modal, and there the modal.js file, as always without the file extension. And then take the modal and add it to the JSX of the burger builder. Now here we got our auxiliary component, we got the burger and the build controls. Now here I'll simply add modal, and of course this will soon be adjusted to not be visible all the time. Right now, if we save this, we see the modal box here in the middle, of course without any content, because as I said, we should wrap this modal around the content we want to display, and right now it's a self-closing element and therefore not wrapping itself around anything. The goal was to show the order summary. And this burger builder file is already getting quite crowded. So I don't want to add the logic to transform this array into a nicely structured summary into this file. I will outsource it into its own component as this is generally a good practice in React. Have granular, focused components. The component I want to create is an order summary component. And I will add this under components, burger, and there it makes sense to be added on the same level as build controls and burger ingredients, I guess. So let's add the order summary there, and in there, of course, the order summary.js file. Now in here, I'll create a function, order summary, which receives some props, and which then should have a normal function body, because I'll have to execute some code to get the order summary, the ingredients I get, into the right format and so on. Of course, as always, we need to import React from React, and we also want to export order summary as the file default. Now, how should we output the order summary? How should this look like? In the end, I want to have like a title which says your order, maybe a short text, then a list of all the items in the order and the price, and then maybe a question, continue to checkout, and some buttons. So quite some stuff. Now, I don't really need a wrapping element here, therefore I will import my auxiliary element from aux, aux. So now we can return some JSX code here with a wrapping auxiliary element. And no worries, we're going to add some logic in front of the return statement so that it makes sense to have a real function body and not just the return statement. So there I will add a h3 tag where I say your order. Below that, I want to add a paragraph where I simply say delicious burger with the following ingredients, colon. And now I want to add an unordered list which should contain, well, as many list items as needed to output all the information about my burger. So for each ingredient, one list item. Of course, I could hard code that in there, but I want to create this dynamically because we're always dynamic in React. So there I will create a new variable, actually a constant because I don't plan on changing it, ingredient summary, which should take some ingredients I expect to get as props and basically map them into list items. Now for the ingredients, we're going to have the old problem that these are in an object format and not an array. Now, of course, we could also create this component in a way to expect an array and transform the array in the burger builder, where we will then pass it on to order summary. But you can also do it the other way around and simply pass the object on and do the transformation in order summary. It's the approach I'll follow because I believe that this allows us to keep the burger builder a bit leaner, though you could argue for both directions where this should happen. So here I expect to get my ingredients in an object format. And in the end, what I want to output is something like this. I want to have a list item where I can basically say the name, like salad, and then simply the number of ingredients of that type. And I would have a list item for each ingredient, of course. Now, when hard coding this, it would of course be easier because I could just hard code for list items and access the respective property on the ingredients object, but I want to create it in a bit more flexible way. This is the output I want to have in the end though. So what we can do is we can take the ingredients we get here and again use object keys to transform this into an array of the keys of salad and so on. Now as before, we want to map this. We want to map this into an array of JSX elements at the end. So we got the ingredient keys here as an input, and we want to return, well, basically this list item I just defined here. So let's grab the list item and add it here. Now, how do we get the salad there, or the ingredient name? Now, that's just our ingredient key. And the value is just props ingredients and then access the ingredient key. And that's all. The only thing I'll add is I'll wrap the ingredient key here in a span because I want to capitalize it. So turn the first letter into a capital one, because in our ingredients array managed in the burger builder, in the ingredients object, excuse me, we of course have salad, bacon, and so on, all starting with lowercase characters. Now for outputting them, I want to have uppercase starting characters. So therefore I wrap the name into a span so that I can use some inline stylings here and simply set this to a JavaScript object. That is why I have double curly braces. The outer pair is for marking a dynamic entry, and the inner curly braces are simply a JavaScript object. And there I will set the text transform CSS property to capitalize. So simply using some inline styles here. Now let me wrap this over multiple lines to make it a bit easier to read. So we have the list item here, and in that list item we have our span. Now this is what I want to create, a list of these list items. And now we can simply output ingredient summary inside of that unordered list. And I won't style this unordered list because here for this rare occasion I'll actually use the default style of all these elements, which is why the order summary component doesn't even have its own order summary CSS file. Though of course you are free to add one and style this to your needs. And then I want to add a paragraph where I say continue to checkout, like that. Now let's go with this approach for now, with this order summary, and let's use it in the burger builder. I want to pass it between my modal opening and closing tags. So let's first of all import this order summary component from our components folder, and there from the burger folder, from the order summary folder and the order summary file. These import statements can get quite long. Now let's grab that order summary variable in which we saved the import, and let's go down to the modal and change this to have a opening and closing tag. And in between, I now want to output my order summary, of course, as a self-closing component here. To work correctly, order summary of course needs to get the ingredients property because we're accessing ingredients on the props object here in order summary. So we need to pass our ingredients, and we do get them from our state. So this state ingredients. Now let's see how that looks like. If we save all the files and we go back to our application, you see that we get a warning. We forgot to add the key to our array, but generally this looks good. And if I click these buttons, it updates in the modal too. Of course, it would be a good idea to not constantly show this modal, but we're going to work on this soon. Let's fix this key error first. And of course, it's easy to fix. Try this on your own. It's in the order summary, of course. Here on the list item, we have to add a key, and that key should be a unique key, as you know. Now let's simply use the IG key, so salad and so on, as a key here. And with that, the warning should be gone. Now the next step is to make sure that we don't always see the modal, but that we can add it or show it once you click order now.